started. Thank you for coming. Hope you had a nice lunch. So this session is a discussion about Storyful and also about its acquisition by News Corp back in December. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Storyful and the work it does with news organizations, probably talk a bit about verification and user-generated content, and probably also talk a little bit about, because we have the Vice President of Strategy of News Corp, a little bit about where Storyful fits into sort of the strategy that's evolving for News Corp, which, if you don't know, was recently there were the old News Corp was separated into two entities, and the new News Corp owns all of the newspapers, Amplify, which is an education business, I guess, as well as some financial data as well would be kind of part of the Dow Jones package. So my name is Craig Silverman, and I'll be asking them questions, and I'll be asking all of you to please join in as well, and we'll leave lots of time for questions from the floor. And so I guess as a starting point, Mark, you're the CEO and founder of Storyful. You were a correspondent and host for the public broadcaster in Ireland. Give us a bit of the background, sort of. So Storyful started. What was the vision, and then how did that sort of evolve to the point where there was this moment where maybe you were looking to exit, or somebody came to you to talk about that?
Also, Mark, I'm not sure if everybody knows exactly what all the things Storyful does. So maybe
yeah. So when we started out, to begin with, I was a foreign correspondent. It got to a point, I suppose, in 2009.
Oh, you got it.
There we go. Can you hear me? Thank you. Typical journalist, can't even work a microphone. So yeah, I was a foreign correspondent, and I got to a point in 2009 where I realized the thing that I loved most, which was storytelling, was a threat in a certain sense from user-generated content, where it seemed to me that this flood of unverified chaos almost in social media platforms could overwhelm journalism. It was also clear that the business model for traditional journalism was under threat as well. So my idea was, what would happen if you created a news organization from scratch? If you didn't care about your legacy issues or your printing presses or your satellite dishes, but just from scratch, what would a news agency look like? And that's what we built, Storyful. The aim was to discover, to verify, and to acquire the most valuable content, user content, that we could find on platforms like YouTube, Twitter. And so we evolved primarily with news as our core. We serve newsrooms. We have a subscription product, which about 40 of the biggest newsrooms in the world use. But we slowly started to see that this was more than just about news content. It was about stories. It was about the idea that so many more people than simply journalists are interested in engaging audiences in a completely new way with social and mobile and video. And so I suppose what happened and how it led to the acquisition was we realized last year that we had a business model that was working. We were approaching a point where we could see break even coming. And we realized at that point that we wanted to turbocharge what we were doing. We wanted to be a global force, and we needed support for that. It just so happened that one of the people I respect most in this business is Raju Narasetti, and who approached me last year. We started talking about the stage the company was at. And I realized that News Corp, given the name, that journalism is in its DNA. We were talking to other people potentially about investment and acquisition, but they didn't have the same vision of a transformation of journalism. Because in many ways, what I feel like with Storyful is we're almost like this startup within a startup, where News Corp is transforming itself. And when we talked, I realized there was real simpatico, there was parallel tracks, there was a sense that we were going to take on new markets, and most of all, with Raju and the team from News Corp, they had tremendous ambitions for Storyful. So now we're in a situation where we work with news organizations, but we are also developing an offering for brands, for advertisers and companies who want to engage with audience around very compelling content. And so we're moving into that area. We're also looking at financial intelligence, because we feel that market-moving information is something that the social web is very good at spreading. So Storyful is getting bigger, ambition's getting bigger, and thankfully with News Corp, we're already having responses that we never dreamed of. I think 4 months in, touch wood, the acquisition and the process that it's created has exceeded my expectations, and I'm tremendously excited about the future.
So Raju, as I said, you're a Vice President of Strategy at News Corp. So we hear sort of a little bit from the Storyful side of it. They were looking to sort of get scale to sort of meet the ambitions they had. How did it come to your attention, the company? What was the value that you saw, and how does that fit into what you're trying to do at the new News Corp?
Sure. I hope that pretty soon we'll stop talking about News Corp and acquisition of Storyful and just talk about the larger picture of verification, because I think that's kind of more interesting and more important for all of you and for us as well. So I was a customer of Mark. The Wall Street Journal had just become a newsroom that was using it, and I had a very selfish business reason, honestly, to look at Storyful, which is this acknowledgement on our part that even though we are a large media company and we have probably about globally maybe 5,000-6,000 journalists across all of our newspapers, I could see very soon a point in time where we would not be able to add more and more journalists to produce more and more content. And when you looked at, so what was the, meanwhile our audiences were demanding a lot more content, especially on the video side. So when you looked at where content was being created, you realized that our readers and anybody with a mobile phone these days can create content. And they were creating like literally hundreds of hours of video, uploading it. And a lot of it was kind of junk, but a lot of it was also relevant, especially in the context of breaking news. And the struggle we had was that we owned brands like the Wall Street Journal, the Times of London, the Australian. These are like these big flagship brands that everybody trusts. And our problem was we couldn't really take outside content and put it through our platforms without worrying about what happens to the trust and what happens to the quality. And here comes Storyful, whose main mission was to verify and say that if somebody says this video is from Syria, it is not a video 2 years ago from Iran or Iraq. So mixing their journalism, their proprietary kind of software, and the way they do things, it was a very scalable way to find a lot of content that we could then supply to our readers, which wasn't created by our journalists. So it solved a kind of a long-term business issue for me. The other issue is that if the Associated Press had any sense, they would not allow a Storyful to exist, right? Because they are this gigantic kind of news agency, but they're so caught up in their own content that they will never ever extend their reach and platform to curate social media. And so for us, and I'm friends with AP, so it's not like I don't like them, but I look at Storyful and say, this is the news agency of the 21st century. And why not then give it the resources to really go global, to go to every continent, because social media is being created in every continent, and take them from primarily being focused on English to other languages. And also, finally, and it's happening a little bit with, perhaps not well known in Europe, but definitely happening in the US, brands are starting to create a lot of content, the Pepsis and the Cokes and the IBMs of the world. And they also want to kind of curate user-generated content that is about their brands and about their... And Storyful gives us an opportunity to go to a GE and say that if you are interested in innovation and you want to kind of collect all the interesting conversations in social media about innovation, their fear is that they don't know if it's a bot, they don't know who is behind that content. But Storyful can provide them a very verified stream of social content that they can put on GE's website. So all of a sudden it opens up another new opportunity for us to go to brands and expand what Storyful can do. So for a variety of reasons, it makes a lot of sense for us. We very deliberately, when we talked to Mark and talked about how we would structure it, so News Corp is a holding company. We actually don't run any companies. The companies, Wall Street Journal is run out of Dow Jones, Times of London is run out of News UK. But with Storyful, we deliberately kept it at the News Corp level because we want them to be able to go to a New York Times, we want them to be able to go to a Reuters or a Guardian, who might be competing with the Wall Street Journal, and still be able to work with them. Because the value that Storyful provides is in the verification layer, and that can be used by any brand that even competes with News Corp. And so the idea was to keep them very separate. And then one last point. A lot of us want to use social media, a lot of us do use it, but in the video space, there is a significant problem in taking social media without having the rights to use it. you could get somebody could turn around and sue a newsroom simply because you've used their video. So one of the great things that Storyful does is it manages the rights. So you don't have to worry about whether you have the rights to run that great, amazing video, because Storyful takes care of it. So that addresses a pretty significant legal issue that's only going to become bigger with user-generated content.
So let's definitely talk a little bit about sort of verification as it's often described as kind of the core value of your business. I'm interested, do you still see it that way? Because Raju has just brought up what, from my perspective as an outsider, I thought was a really game-changing thing for your company, which was doing this rights management on YouTube, which opened up a whole other revenue stream and, you know, is a whole other offering to your customers. So is verification still, like, is that still the first thing that you think people see the value in, or do you see that actually being eclipsed over time by this licensing business? That's
Not at all, and I think what is broadly I'd like to talk about today in the broader sense and just Storyful is the emergence of kind of this pillars of an ethical business model for user-generated content emerging, and not just with Storyful, but I think we are pioneering that business model. And in some ways it's very much like an old newspaper model where the front page was Baghdad. It never made money. You didn't make money off your Baghdad bureau. You made money off your classified advertising. You made money off all the other activities you did, luxury magazines. And in some ways now, the new business model that's emerging, I think, for digital is a combination of the substantial news that we have come to expect from a traditional news organization. We spend a lot of time verifying videos in Syria. We may take hours. It's not something that we're going to make money out of, but it's essential. It's core to what we do. It's core to our values. But at the same time, you know, some kid laughing at his mother singing a song which goes to 30 million views. The point for us is that that generates a lot of revenue. And now, at the moment, that revenue is not going back to the uploader. There is no share. There's no partnership. And so for us, what we've seen is the creation of this really exciting, and I think transformative relationship between publishers and the creators of user-generated content, and maybe even citizen journalists, to use a terrible phrase that we always use, that the relationship, Storyful is in the middle, brokering that relationship, that partnership, in a way that rewards everybody that's creating compelling content, whether it be that mother who's filming her child or be a citizen journalist in Syria. And I think from our point of view, it is all logical that we would expand our operations to wherever user-generated content goes. We wanted to carry with it an ethical business model. We want to carry with it the verification that comes from the activities that we have, but also the knowledge that the business has to change. The news business, brands have to change. They have to give credit where credit's due when it comes to user content. It is no different than any content created by an original publisher. People have a right to be compensated and credited, and it's not happening at the moment. So, you know, whatever about, you know, the emergence of new revenue streams for us, that's what gets me up in the morning, is the idea that we can actually do something to help both the news business and brands, but also the creators of this compelling content, to form a partnership together. And that's the core of the future. It used to be your audience, it's no longer your audience. It's now your partner in reporting and gathering news. And I hope that's what Storyful will be, is right at the center of that, almost like the Intel chip in the IBM computer, creating an operating system, working with everybody, whether it's social networks like Facebook and YouTube, or it's news agencies like AP and Reuters. And I hope we're seen to be a very distinct element, and in fact, I hope you know, a critical element in the emergence of this new business model.
I mean, so this year, for example, if the current run rate is sustained, Storyful will manage about 1.2 billion videos.
Yep.
But the keyword is managed.
1.2 billion views of videos, right. Yeah.
The keyword is managed, right? Which is that they identify interesting video, they get the rights, but the videos actually air on in newsrooms and their platforms. So the revenue opportunity is for those brands that use Storyful as a kind of a service provider. Mm-hmm. So it is creating also a significant revenue stream for Storyful's customers, including News Corp.
But also, Craig, you know, 20% perhaps of everything we do is by definition a public utility, because we operate in public. We have to collaborate with other people to verify. We have an open newsroom, which we partner with Google to create, where the verification process takes place in the clear light of day, not behind the walls of a newsroom. And so for us, that's absolutely necessary to what we do. But we've now realized, well, actually, let's build that out. Let's make this open newsroom concept work everywhere. So we've just done a deal with Facebook, where we are publicly helping Facebook surface compelling content. And so for us, again, verification is not going to become less important. I think it's going to become even more important. And eventually what we hope to do is help people do it themselves and build a technology that we use right now internally. I want to productize that, and I want to put it in the hands of every single journalist so they can do the job of discovery and verification. And we, as I say, become the operating system.
That's one of the things I've always wondered is, I know you guys have released at least I think 1 or 2 tools. One's a search tool you can put in your browser. And I always wondered what you have built that only you guys have, that the rest of us don't see. It sounds like there is something there, and it sounds like you may be looking to, I guess that would be an additional thing you would sell to newsrooms or make available for people to purchase individually.
Yeah, and we're already moving that way, where more and more people are looking for this product their way, rather than us telling us, here's how we produce it. They're saying to us, well, show us the secret sauce. So just to give you very quickly the process we go through and where the technology fits in. We build a whole series of databases for every social platform. Twitter lists are still primarily important for us. We have technology that allows us, we see maybe 10 names on any subject or region. The technology then goes and looks at the conversations those 10 people are having and then extracts another 50, 60 people who are authoritative sources on the basis of the interactions that we observe. It's called node analysis, is the technology behind it. So the list now is complete. We look at the conversations happening. We have a piece of technology that looks at the velocity of a conversation. So let's just say in Perugia today, on average, there are 10 Twitter messages emerging from this town. This festival happens, there's 200 a minute. We see a velocity in conversation, which is a really good indication that something's happened that's excited this community. And every news event in this digital age creates a community. And our technology is basically engaging with that community to find out when they're excited about something. We get that alert. We have an alert bot, as we call it, at which point we have the keywords that are exciting attention. They can be any language. And we then have a product or an internal curation tool called Stream Desk, which essentially has taken the APIs of every social platform, and then we're plugging in those search terms. We geolocate with a news event, for example, happens, an explosion in Harlem in New York. We draw a circle around it, and every single piece of content being uploaded with any kind of metadata in that area goes into our system. So now you can see we have journalists building at the beginning, technology helping us scale, and then technology helping us take the content out of the social platforms and begin the process of verification, where we then have additional tools at our disposals to help us, things like reverse image search, things like location. And because now much more of the content coming from phones is geolocated, the job of verification is getting much easier. So just to understand it, the technology is creating an intelligent stream on top of this tsunami of content, which essentially is platform neutral, and allowing our journalists to, 40 journalists around the world, to scale their operations to process around 1,000 videos a month, for example. So we only see the technology becoming more important. We think we'll productize it, so we'll give this to people to do it themselves, but the human element will never go away. It'll be the vitally important part of this, the human algorithm, as we call it.
You've mentioned the relationship you have with Google. You mentioned the relationship with Facebook. You recently launched Facebook Newswire with them. As far as I know, you're probably the only news organization who's actually getting paid by Facebook and Google. Is that yeah?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's true or not. I mean, these things, you never know what the right hand is doing, what the left hand is doing. We don't know. I think what's common to all of them, and this is really important, is that they don't want to be publishers. They don't want to be news organizations. They are predicated on the basis that any conversation is equally valid as the next conversation on their platform. And yet at the same time, they have a vested interest in seeing the really compelling, sometimes historically significant content emerging and surfacing. So there is catch-22, and we've solved that problem for them. So they don't take responsibility for our editorial decisions, but they're happy to help us with access to their APIs, with other help as well. And to be honest, financially, what's more important for us is the clear validation that our strategy of working with everybody, being completely agnostic, is paying off dividends, where we can work with Facebook, Google, YouTube. We would like to work in China. I think our next big opportunity is to be working with Weibo, Tencent, Youku, to take the vast UGC content that's there and start to surface the really compelling stuff, and obviously the accompanying revenue. So, I think we see the revenue base for Storyful being much more about that content rather than the direct
What you
relationship.
find rather than what you're being paid to go look for it or what have you.
Yeah, we wouldn't be here today if it was all about getting newsrooms to pay huge amounts of money, put it that way.
Right. Actually, I keep complaining that they're too cheap.
You said there's roughly about 40 newsrooms that are customers right now.
So 40 that have a direct subscription to our newswire, but we
Okay.
work with hundreds of newsrooms who sometimes don't even know that they're consuming Storyful content because they get it from networks like the European Broadcasting Union. We also then have hundreds of clients who are buying content off of or licensing it. We work with Yahoo, we work with MSN, we work with a whole bunch of platforms that are revenue sharing with us on content. So, I mean, we're pretty much embedded now in all of the biggest social networks, all the big newsrooms, and increasingly what's exciting for us is to be talking to newsrooms in places like Pepsi. I mean, one of the things that amazes me is the biggest newsrooms in the world will soon be General Electric, MasterCard, Visa, and that for me is just a really eye-opener. So the jobs in journalism, kids, if you're out there, are probably going to be in creating engaging content around conversations relating to brands.
So
Craig, sorry.
you mentioned the brands piece, and actually this might be something for you to talk about as well. I mean, what are they looking for? And is it video heavy? Are they trying to just listen and monitor, or are they actually how far are they to the publishing step at this point?
So there is a wrong perception out there that brands are getting into the news business. They're not, actually. They don't want to be anywhere near the news business. What they want to be is in the storytelling business. So a brand like GE, for which innovation and themes around innovation, the conversations around innovation are very important, they want to be able to participate in that conversation no matter where that's happening and when it's happening. And the way they can do it is to kind of be able to identify that there's a conversation around something innovative happening in some corner of Twitter that it's very hard for GE to kind of A, figure out in real time, and B, make sure that it's good conversation as opposed to not so good. And I think that's where something like Storyful comes in, because then they can actually curate that and provide a stream of that to GE, and GE can then surface it wherever it wants to surface. I wanted to go back to a point that Mark made and about who pays and who doesn't pay. There is also increasingly significant value in Storyful saying, not that something is verified, but in Storyful actually alerting newsrooms saying this is not yet verified. Meaning that don't kind of put speed over accuracy. This has not been verified. So it's allowing a lot of newsrooms not to make mistakes. Pause and kind of wait for some kind of verification. I think that's a pretty important function, and that's a function that Storyful performs kind of for free on Twitter. Anybody can follow Storyful, and
The hashtag is often daily debunked too for fake stuff, right?
and that's a pretty important, because Margaret Sullivan talked about it earlier today as well, and I think it's becoming increasingly an issue for newsrooms where this fear of sacrificing accuracy in order to be first or in order to jump on things is going to really undermine the brand's trust and undermine readers' trust in us. And I think it's important to kind of sometimes just pause and say, it's okay if you don't kind of retweet it in the next second, 10 minutes later, and oftentimes it's verified in the sense that they say don't use it because it's not what it says it is.
I mean, I always say that we are probably the first newsroom to high-five each other when we stop a story, not create a story, because it has a vital significance for us. And it speaks to a wider point as well, I think, about where news is going, and that the old model of breaking news in which newsrooms competed to own a story is dead. At least when it comes to events. It's not dead when it comes to things like the Snowden revelations, but it is dead when you have an event happens and suddenly everybody's chasing to have a proprietary fact that no one else has. It's just, that's over. I personally think, maybe that's a bit too dramatic, but the point I'm trying to make is you will be more often wrong than you will be first in the context of breaking news, particularly on the social web. So we all have a vested interest now in cooperating together to make sure that the first sort of 15, 20 minutes of a story do not take the kind of course that perhaps the coverage of the Boston bombing took, for example, where you had people just throwing things out that they'd seen on Reddit without verification. And I think there's where, again, I say about this public utility, is that we all have this vested interest to cooperate together. And that's in our DNA, to be honest, in history. I mean, the Associated Press began when all the New York newspapers pooled together to cover the Spanish-American War in the 19th century. As a correspondent, I would share tapes with the BBC in the field. And so I think there is actually precedent for all of us realizing that the old model of breaking news in this digital age needs to be completely overhauled, and part of that will be collaboration between news organizations.
Storyful does a lot of blog posts and speaking in workshops to kind of spread the skills of verification, and yet at the same time, it's one of the unique selling points of what you folks provide. And I'm wondering if you see a time where, because it's spread enough, and you've actually done a good job of educating people, that there's more of that in newsrooms, and the value that they'll look from you is less on that and other things. Like, do you think it will get to that point, or?
Well, I hope it gets to that point in one way, because there's a built-in obsolescence about this element of what we do, in that once people catch up, and they already are, and we're seeing a huge sea change over the past even a year, where we see people doing this at a local level or in the siloed level. What we give is scale. And obviously with the technology as well, what I hope is that it's not just about verifying big global stories like Syria, but that every single newsroom, no matter how small their market, will be verifying with this same degree of accuracy and commitment on local stories. So I do feel that this could actually be a help to the kind of hyper-local news model, which is under serious pressure at the moment, where we can build technology and systems that help people do themselves. So, teach a person to fish. That's kind of what we're doing at the moment, and we hope to be supplying the fishing rods.
So if the local paper, using technology from you, can identify an early stage video that ends up going viral, and engage and help be a partner with the creator, and through you, then there's revenue for everybody. Is that the idea?
Exactly, and to be honest, there's a lot of crap, to be quite honest, talked about viral videos and virality and BuzzFeed and all the models, and we think they have some sort of magic ingredient in what they do. It's not true. I mean, virality is kind of created. So when we find a video at 5,000 views and we have a vested interest in helping the person who owns that video to make money, we're pushing it to everybody. We're pushing it to Mashable, who embeds it on their site and drives views. We're giving it to the Ellen DeGeneres show in America, driving views. And again, we're helping to amplify and build up an audience for that video. So again, as you say, it's a good point. If we find that local networks want to push things to us, we can and do amplify and make money for everybody. The platform who publishes, the uploader who creates it, and the case of that 30 million video I talked about earlier on, this 10-month-old kid is going to have a really good, decent college education on the basis of the money they made out of that video. That's kind of a nice thing to be able to say.
One of the challenges of our industry has been that we've always believed in kind of doing everything ourselves. Right. And in the fat and happy days when we had the money, you could put resources against it. And you can still, right? You can take somebody and a full-time staffer and say, your job is to go through Reddit every day and find interesting things, surface them, and we'll have them uniquely. So you could presumably do that. You could put 5 people on looking at a Twitter API. You could put 6 people on. My simple point was that in an industry where we are cutting back on journalism and content creation, why do we want to waste resources on doing things that companies are doing okay and they're not charging a lot of money for it? Instead, if you can then take somebody to create content, right? So the idea is to kind of give some of the tools. In the first wave, as Mark said, if somebody wanted to do something interesting, specifically, they would email Storyful and say, hey, we are interested in this topic, and Storyful would do it for them. Increasingly, we are saying all of those tools can stay in the newsroom and let them do their own thing, because Storyful can move on to doing other things. Right? So I think we just have to get smarter in our industry about what things we can do well and add value, and where we can actually rent it, really, and let somebody else do it because they have the scale and they are constantly investing in the technology. And
that's a really good point, because I think there's the emergence of a service economy around user content, particularly. Some really good companies emerging, not just ours. Some really good people revolutionizing the approach to a story, like Circa on mobile. So we're starting to see a lot of companies emerging that I think are doing what Raju was saying, is scaling, and in some ways reducing the cost for a news organization to take things like verification seriously. And I feel it's like, back in the old days when the first software was developed by people like Bill Gates. I mean, not everybody then went off and tried to build their own version, right? They just decided, okay, it's actually cheaper to bring in that software, and that helps me do my job better. And that's what we always thought. I remember going to a news executive 3 years ago when we were starting our journey. He said, I don't want to buy your service. I don't want to outsource anything. I want you to make me better. And if you can tell me you're doing that, then I'll buy your service. Now, they didn't buy at the time, but they have come back to us. So, I think that's really the approach and the question I ask myself.
So from your sense of talking to so many newsrooms, do you get a sense, Jeff Jarvis has, sort of popularized a saying, do what you do best and link to the rest.
Absolutely.
And that's sort of what you're saying in terms of actually skills within a newsroom, that people need to realize, here's where we add value, here's where we're best, and let's find the services to provide the other stuff? Is that sort of the idea?
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, I think, we always say we don't want to replace journalism. We are storytellers, but we're giving you the content to help you tell better stories. So you add the value, you add the context. The one area I think I'm still disappointed in after 4 years is newsrooms are still not taking their responsibilities to the creators of content on the social web seriously. It's just not happening. I mean, if anybody wants to see that, Claire Wardle, who's in the front here, for Tao, has done a piece of research which is just quite stark about how few newsrooms credit creators of user-generated content, let alone compensate. And I think there's a class action lawsuit coming down the tracks for all these big newsrooms that have been ripping off content from YouTube and saying credit YouTube, which I think I said last year is like saying credit telephone. It's just crazy. And you're on the wrong side of history, first of all, but secondly, you're going to be in trouble if you keep having a cavalier attitude to people's content. And so from that point of view, I would say that, wouldn't I? Because I'm in the business of helping you ensure you don't get in trouble. But at the same time, this is one of the biggest challenges. Forget about drones and BuzzFeed. This idea that we have responsibility as storytellers to the people who help us tell those stories is front and center in my mind, and it's not front and center in the news industry, and that disappoints me.
It'll take just one lawsuit to get the entire newsroom to stop using social media and user-generated content. It's that, because lawsuits tend to be expensive, and your lawyers then will say, well, don't do anything because you're getting us into trouble.
Well, wait till BuzzFeed gets drones, then people will really lose their minds.
We will all work for them someday.
So, you talked a little bit about all of the, you discover from all the major social media networks or others you want to get to. One of the issues that is emerging with these social media networks is that, the free and public APIs that are available are increasingly limited, and you need to pay to get access to the full thing. Twitter just bought GNIP, which is one of their full fire hose providers. The Twitter API is not all of the tweets. It's a lot, but it's not all of them. How is that? I mean, what's your take on sort of that move? And are you already paying to have to get access to do the full fire hose from whether it's Twitter or other ones right now?
No, we don't pay, and we work. We've worked with DataSift and GNIP and some of these wholesalers of the fire hose in the past, and the value for us is not great. It can be huge for other people who are looking for specific signals out of the social web. There is definitely something, put it this way, everybody's going to want to make money from their API. There's no question about that. But they do have a vested interest in keeping it open to at least some extent, because, again, you've seen from Facebook and YouTube coming to us and asking us to work with them to try and surface content. By restricting their API, they make it much more difficult for people to do useful things with that fire hose. So obviously the biggest challenge for Twitter right now is when new users come on to that platform, they find it really hard to plug into the interesting voices and the stories worth telling. And so by closing off your API, you are closing off your ability in one way to make it more useful. I think the other thing is the multitude of new platforms. vContact in Russia, Orkut in Brazil, which is still going, LiveJournal in Russia, Weibo, Tencent, WeChat. I was just come back from Hong Kong where all of the buses had ads for Weibo. So I think what we're going to see is huge competition for the eyeballs and interest of people using social platforms, and I just don't see why that would be good business for people to restrict it.
And also, I think in the English-speaking world, we tend to forget that there is a big non-English-speaking social media world.
Yeah.
Right? And there is no way, even if you want to do it on your own, you're going to have people who can speak Chinese and follow Chinese social media because topics tend to be fairly global. I think, so again, it goes back to this issue of anything can be done by you or by a newsroom. It's just a matter of whether do you want to put the resources in doing that, or do you want to put the resources in creating content, which is what newsrooms are good at.
One of the, when the acquisition was first announced and some of the interviews that you guys did, one of the clear messages was obviously to kind of turbocharge what you wanted to do. The other one was going after international customers and getting into other languages. So it's been It's been roughly about 100 days since the acquisition. On that front, sort of what are the key things that have happened, and in terms of the ambitions that have been stated as of right now, where do you sit with that?
So we just did our report back to the executive group in News Corp the other day, and it was great to do the deck, and it just wrote itself on what we've achieved in the 4 months. So obviously our company is much stronger. We're expanding. But, for example, our partnerships are getting bigger and more complicated and sophisticated. With a whole range of clients like ABC News, we're starting to work with Vice News. We work very closely with them on their new news product. which is very exciting for us. And also, the Facebook deal has been huge for us, but also in the background, we have now started to make partnerships in places that we never expected to before. So we just had our first Latin American client 2 weeks ago. Again, I was in Hong Kong to see what the opportunity might be in Asia, and the opportunity in places like Asia is quite stunning, because if you remember, if you think about the Western countries that have their addiction to social media has taken years to develop. Not many years, but years. They've gone through all kinds of mistakes to get there. And now you've got these people coming straight on from analog to digital and going straight to the most sophisticated phones. I mean, you walk down a street in Hong Kong and everybody's got their Samsung and they're all filming videos. So I feel that places like Africa, large parts of Asia, parts of the Middle East, are coming online and going directly to the most sophisticated types of products. And bypassing. They didn't have to go through MySpace and Bebo to get where they are. They went
Lucky
straight from
them. Oh,
exactly.
God. Yeah.
But it's almost like Germany and Japan after the war. They built from scratch, and that's what's happening in these markets, and that's why they're so exciting. And we've had a lot of great responses in the past 3 months.
I mean, we do the 100 days thing to just keep Mark on his toes, but the reality is that look, we own the New York Post, which is 212 years old. The Wall Street Journal is 125 years old. So I want to be thinking more in terms of the 50th anniversary of Storyful rather than the first one. So we are in the very, very early stages of this. So not particularly worried about 100 or 200 or even 300 days.
What's the broader vision then for them? Like when you think of where you, as News Corp, where you folks want to go, and them as a piece of it. And I mean, the other day, News Corp just acquired Harlequin, biggest romance publisher, I think.
Spent a little bit more money than I did for
Yes,
Storyful.
yes, that was $400 million and change. This was $25 million. Is that right?
Yeah.
And sorry, Mark, I don't mean to. So obviously you said it's a holding company, so it's not surprising. Very different types of companies. But where do those all fit in with that broader vision that you sort of mentioned there?
I think, again, feel like very, very early stages of social media and user-generated content. I have a feeling that is going to be a pretty significant part of all of our news brands, especially in video. And so there's a long, long way to go in terms of how much newsrooms are going to use social media and how it'll evolve. Languages is a pretty big issue for us, and taking Storyful into, again, China and Latin America and Ukraine and India, I think that's still out there. We still haven't even started worrying about content being created in Snapchat, content being created in these kind of ephemeral products that are coming, and how to deal with that, because I think there is some value to kind of looking at that as well. And you never know, as we speak, somebody is probably inventing the next Twitter and the next Facebook, and they're going to come online, and before you know, have 400 million users, and then we'll have to deal with that. So I think it's just a matter of wanting to be almost treated as an open source kind of a model, which embraces new things, gives more and more of the technology back to the newsroom so they can move on to the next new thing, because otherwise they would spend all their time serving a newsroom rather than letting the newsroom do what it does. So I think it's just a very long-term horizon. And I shouldn't underestimate the internal impact an acquisition of Storyful has on News Corp. It kind of sends a pretty strong signal that our future is about user-generated content. Our future is about digital and verification rights. And that's pretty important, because a lot of our newsrooms, mainstream newsrooms, still are very traditional, because they've been around for a long time. They're very successful. And so using Storyful internally to drive cultural change is also a big part of acquiring them.
I mean, my ambition would be with News Corp is that we have a very difficult situation for publishers, particularly of newspapers, where they know they've got to make a transition, but the transition could kill them. If they cannibalize their existing print product, if they, give things away for free that undermine their existing product. And I think user-generated content and the kind of services we provide allow them to kind of have the best of both worlds. They can still have strong core products, but develop new ones and new content to bring them in. And we've seen an insatiable desire for that. So I think we see more and more that news publishers on digital are becoming both content exchanges and also ad exchanges. And I think that's what I've seen emerging. And I think we're certainly within News Corp supplying the content side of the house. But remember, there's been coinciding with this revolution in news, there's been a revolution in advertising as well. And I think we have to think about those things as well as we think about news as we go forward.
So I've got two more questions, so I'd like everybody to start thinking of yours, please. We're going to leave lots of time for that discussion. So I'm interested in sort of the cultural aspect you raised of, acquiring Storyful, sending a message. A lot of the newspapers in News Corp, or at least some of them are tabloids, very large tabloids, like a New York Post, like a Sun. And so, with the sort of the approach that they have, and then looking at user-generated content, I can almost see somewhat of a connection between the very populist kind of approach that they have and UGC that would attract a lot of eyeballs. I think there's alignment there, but on the cultural side, you can almost see them saying, well, we'll create our stories and we'll create it. Why are we taking it from elsewhere? Has there been, some of that there? And what about that alignment piece? Is that valid?
Yeah, so the approach we have taken is that Mark and the team treat our own internal brands as any other customer. So the conversations are that here's all the things we can do, here's how we can help you, do you want our help? And it's possible that some newsroom embraces them fully and some take their time. And we're not forcing, and by the way, we charge them.
Right.
All of our newsrooms pay Storyful, there's nothing free.
So you should really be complaining about how little he charges people then in some ways, right?
They don't charge them enough.
Well, but the idea behind it, right, to have the CEO of News Corp say that we are making a big bet on user-generated content is a huge change agent, because at the Wall Street Journal, there was a resistance to using user-generated content because on the business journalism side, there isn't much good user-generated content. There's a lot of rumors, there's a lot of speculation about stocks. Yeah. But then saying, look, we now have Storyful that can actually give you verified UGC. And by the way, a lot of your readers also want to consume interesting video. Right? I think that is starting to move the needle quite a bit. And this helps when you come into your annual budget conversations and the editors say, well, we need 50 more journalists because we have to produce all this content. All of a sudden we are saying, wait a minute, there's Storyful, right? If you need more video, they can provide a lot more video. So why do we need to add our own staff in this space? Why can't you add them in an area that there is a clear gap? So it's helping those conversations as well. It's a slightly longer term play than an immediate change. But the idea that a very traditional mainstream print-based company has gone out and made its first acquisition be a user-generated content verification company, I think that sends kind of a very interesting signal.
And to your point about the cultural fit between, let's say, a populist newspaper like The Sun or the New York Post and user-generated content, we've been in this, working with The Sun quite a lot about developing product around sport. So, for example, everyone goes to a game now, a soccer game, for example, with their camera. And you want to see it. I mean, you put a ring fence around some of the big, like Anfield with Liverpool, and the stuff coming out of those grounds is amazing. It's really, for me, I love watching, when I'm looking at our curation, the stream of content coming in. Japanese soccer, we did a project called Ball. We worked with them about, Asian soccer. There's like 55 Twitter accounts about Manchester United and Vietnam alone, and so everybody's having these conversations that traditionally were in the kind of populist newspapers, and I think we're hoping to lead that kind of group and category of news organization to be in the middle of this community and to engage with it.
I'll give a specific example. At the New York Post, there was a tennis tournament in New York, and the tennis channel came to the New York Post and said, we are interested in kind of curating the conversation around that tournament. So Storyful then provided all of that conversation about that tennis event, which New York Post then put on a very compelling page, had advertising against it. So it got both audience engagement and revenue. And when you have a couple of examples like that, then the other newsrooms start kind of paying attention because they see it as a way to actually make money as well.
So the other thing I was wondering about is when you contact people who've uploaded something to YouTube that you think has potential, what is their reaction when they're suddenly, when you're contacting them? Because for a long time, at least a few years, it was contacting to sort of verify and things like that. Now you're actually contacting and say, how about we help manage this for you? I mean, how much explaining has to be done, and how do you convince them that this isn't yet another scam out there?
Yeah, it's a great point, and there are a lot of people playing in the field of trying to acquire this content, and what they used to do is give, here, listen, I'll give you $250. That's much more than they'll ever earn, and goodbye. And then take the content, take it off YouTube and sell it for a lot more money. So there was a lot of agencies did that to begin with. What we're starting to see, our model is this, that we go to the individual and say, we will rights manage on YouTube. So we'll take your video, we'll leave it on its original channel in its original form, and what we do now is YouTube give us what's called content ID. It means that we can watch any other scrape or copy of that video and claim the advertising that's made against it. We give it back, the overwhelming majority of the revenue, to the individual. We then take the same video and we give it to Yahoo, who give us back a chunk of the revenue, of which again the overwhelming majority goes back to the uploader. We work with distributors, syndicators, to then sell clips and license these clips to anyone from MTV. I mean, if you've seen user-generated content of people falling off bikes or cats going down toilets, in the last 6 months, it's probably been Storyful, because we have the relationship there. So you can actually see how this, not just one level of value, it just goes on and on and on. And in the long tail, when an advertiser comes back, has happened one to us recently, where they wanted to buy a video of a cat from Tasmania to use in an ad campaign, and they flew the cat to the United States and paid us a chunk of money for the video. So, so the reaction from people when they hear from us is initially suspicion sometimes. People are getting more aware of their rights and their potential, right? So we had a 15-year-old kid who had learning difficulties. He aced the test. He did really well in this test, and he put a camera up waiting for his father to come home to catch his reaction to the news that he'd done well in his exam. And so father comes in and has this hysterical reaction. It's funny. And we went to the kid, and he negotiated for 3 days. He was the toughest.
The kid?
The kid. No, the kid himself. And we were like, what do we have to do to get you on board? Well, I want this assurance, and is it going to go here? And I think people are becoming more and more aware.
It's a good thing.
It's a great thing. And so you have that woman who had like 10,000 views, and now she's got 30 million. Part of the thing we do is help them manage the attention. So we will communicate with TV shows that want to have her on. We had a kid recently was very cheeky to its mother because the kid couldn't get a cupcake. So the video went viral. We put the mother and the kid on the Ellen DeGeneres show, where she got a $10,000 check from a cupcake company. So these are funny stories that go with the job. They're actually very heartwarming. Sometimes you'll see incredibly inspiring video of people hearing for the first time, and giving people a sense of hope and uplifting, and that's very cool. And I really enjoy that part of the business.
So as I said, we want to get questions from you folks. So does anyone have one right now? We've got one up front. Please, go ahead. The microphone's coming. Just one moment.
Hi, I'm Dennis Redmond. I used to run AP in this Mediterranean area, so I was glad to see that the AP is about to die, because I no longer work with AP, and now I teach journalism at the School of Graduate School of Journalism here at Perugia, among other things. I do some other stuff. But I've run 4 or 5 translation operations in my career, and you danced around the language issue. And frankly, I'm a little bit skeptical about quality control mechanisms and cross-platform dialogue. And so we talked, there was a very interesting panel about, why are American and Anglo-Saxon media telling the story about Europe, and no European media are telling the story about Europe?
Gentleman's right behind you, yes.
Okay. So, this was very interesting. But the fact is that if you don't speak English in your game, so far, it hasn't been demonstrated to me that there are people who are going to have the cultural skills in Mandarin to be able to translate. So it's okay if you have people falling off bathrooms or kids getting A in an English language sculpture. But I don't see where it's going in the language. And you talked about Chinese, but there's also Spanish, et cetera. So I don't see how it's going to play out in that field. And I'd like you to tell us what new tools are coming up and how you're facing this challenge.
Mark can talk a little bit about the tools. I don't think any of us think this is going to be easy, for sure. Right? So I don't want the misconception that somehow we'll look at a Chinese feed of something and be able to do it as quickly as we think we can. But the idea of managing translation is getting actually easier. Right now, for example, the Wall Street Journal is available in Chinese, Bahasa, Japanese, Turkish, German, Korean, Hindi, and it's a combination of human translation, a little bit of machine translation, some user-generated translation as well, and it's not cheap. the thing I always liked about Storyful was that this was not all technology. There was a lot of human curation involved. And even now, with offices in Hong Kong and other places, we have the ability to kind of hire some of the language experts. Because the technology allows an individual to do a lot more with a list and with a flowing social stream, the normal convention thinking that we have that we need to put 15 people to kind of watch every bit of it is a little less of an issue for us. And so I think we are hopeful. It won't, the business won't scale up, and our ability to do that would be curtailed by our capacity in some ways. But a lot of content is being created, and we can't not kind of figure out ways to do it in a smart way.
And I have to say, going back to the inspiration for the business, I was a foreign correspondent, and I was sent out to countries where I would, first of all, hire a fixer, I would hire a translator, I would, have to basically rely on this person to interpret for me when I was in the field. And, when social media came along, we didn't have to mediate like that. We had people who could speak for themselves and be heard. We didn't have to go through translators. So for me, the good old days of foreign reporting were sometimes were not very good old days. They weren't terribly authentic in a war zone, when you were trying to battle the translation issues. So what I've seen is, in the three areas that we work in, discovery, verification, and acquisition, language issues are absolutely paramount. In discovery, as Raju mentions, social media makes it so much easier to discover because we're not looking out for keywords that we recognize in our language. We're looking at the conversation's velocity. So whether it's in Cyrillic script or it's in Spanish or it's in Chinese script, we are surfacing it because we're listening to velocity as opposed to something we can recognize. On verification, we obviously have language skills within the organization. In Asia, for example, Korean, Cantonese, Mandarin. So we have people chasing and talking to people in those languages. But also now with social media, we can go onto platforms and crowdsource nuance in interpretation. So you used to have news organizations would employ someone, let's say, who spoke Arabic and learned their Arabic in Cairo, but they're translating from Arabic spoken in Damascus, or, Arabic itself is an incredibly flexible language. And so what we're doing is we're saying to people, listen, we speak Arabic, or we might speak Arabic, but we're not sure about the nuance in an accent in Aleppo versus Damascus. Can you help us? And we have people who are more than happy to come and help us negotiate not just language issues, but the nuance of dialect, accent. So that's where we do that at verification. And finally, on delivery, this is probably the area where it's a little bit more difficult, where we have to contextualize and add data. And obviously, we are limited by our skills there. But that's where I think, again, our model is actually better in some ways, or more suited to the nuance of language, because we're not actually consumer-facing. We don't have to write the report. And more we're letting the news organization take the content with the data, and they go and they translate it into language that appeals to their audience. So if that just gives you a sense of, I set out to try and overcome this, and I feel as a consequence, we can be more authentic because of social media in a multiplicity of languages. And that's something that I'm very inspired by at the moment.
And the AP is going to live for a very long time.
Have we ever?
Somebody else
Hi,
from AP.
I'm
Yes.
Fergus Bell from the Associated Press, who currently works for the Associated Press. I'm very interested in the ethics of UGC, and when you talk about working with UGC for brands and for news organizations, what kind of ethical codes are you putting in place so that church and state is clearly separated? If you're working on a piece of UGC for a big bucks paying brand client, and there's a piece of UGC with news value that is, critical of a brand customer, how are you going to manage that, and do you have the kind of ethic codes in place for that?
Absolutely, it's a great question. I mean, first of all, about 80% of the videos that pass through our platform, we don't license. We don't have a direct commercial interest in. The ones we do are primarily around user-generated content that's viral. That's about weather events, or it's about sort of lighter fare, if you want to put it that way. So there's not a lot of the conflict of interest when it comes to passing that on to brands. Where we also don't ever take video down. We don't do any exclusive deals. Someone comes to us and says, I'll give you 10 grand if I can own that video outright and you can take it off YouTube. We just don't do that kind of deal. What we do also in terms of the kind of church and state relationship, we're starting our relationship with brands at the moment. And we have very clear ethical standards. And in fact, to be honest, working with the Journal, Wall Street Journal, they have an incredibly exhaustive list of standards that we have, well, one way had to first of all, jump over those hoops, and it's made us much stronger. And part of that is that separation of church and state. And I think the Journal is starting to work on native advertising as well. So we're all negotiating those issues. So it hasn't come up. It wouldn't be something that we would ever be involved in doing, because we're not going to be dealing with the hard news. In China, for example, we will continue to be taking content that may be deemed offensive to the Chinese government. It's not something we're going to change. We go into Weibo and take those photographs quickly before the censor gets them. So that's core to what we do. It'll never change. I think it's going to be just like a newspaper model where our advertising department, generally did not mix with editorial. It's not a hard one right now to negotiate. Maybe in the future it'll become more complicated, but the same rules apply as they do right now, as apply to UGC in terms of that kind of conflict.
And just even from a physical point of view, we deliberately didn't locate Mark and his team at the News Corp corporate office. We have them in a separate space because they do have a newsroom, and we don't want to kind of necessarily even give the perception of somehow these are put together.
They got better coffee in our new building.
There's that.
Another question up front.
Hi. When you're speaking to the user or the person out who's got the content, how do they know that you're actually owned by News International, or do you think they don't care about it?
So we always send them straight to the site where there is basically a licensing page that explains all about the company, and one of the things we obviously clearly indicate that it's News Corp. We've never had a question, not sent it in the 4 months that we've been involved here. And I think the key comes back to this idea. We're not buying the content. We're not going there and saying, we want to own this and take it off your channel. It always stays, and this is one of the basis of our agreements with YouTube, is that we always make sure that we send people back to the iconic, a canonical source, which is the video. So from that point of view, it's different to, let's say, a consumer-facing newspaper where we're buying it for our own personal use and it's proprietary and exclusive. And so we've never had to really engage with any kind of conversation that has acquisition ownership as turned up.
And there'll always be somebody out there who doesn't want to have anything to do with Rupert Murdoch or News Corp, right? That's always going to be the case. We also, because Storyful doesn't create its own content, it's been easy to have a New York Times as a customer because Storyful is just managing content that's available at equal footing to the Journal, to the Post, to the New York Times, or any of the other customers. And that's a very key distinction. I have no qualms in calling it News Corp Storyful, but Storyful is an independent company. It's completely run separately as a full-blown company, and it does report into News Corp. And there's value sometimes in being part of News Corp. There's sometimes value in kind of just not particularly being associated with News Corp.
One thing we haven't lost a single client. We haven't, no one has come back to us and said, wow, you're News Corp now, goodbye. I think part of what's happened is because we're now gone from being the startup that might not be around in 6 months' time to be here for the long term, the 150 years as Raju talks about. They are much more confident in our ability to work with them on a much more professional basis. So actually it's been, if anything, the response has been better than I expected.
It's unlikely that Facebook, for example, would have done anything with Storyful as a small startup because Facebook wasn't going to risk putting a lot of things just on a small company in Dublin. But now that you're part of a larger company, there is a comfort level that you're going to be around for a long time. Not that there were a lot of customers for Storyful before. The other area that I think it helps to be part of News Corp is you bring the ability to kind of have a code of conduct and a legal team, and so all of those in case there are issues in the future.
So we have a legal counsel full-time now, just to the kind of issues we talked about, the ethics issues. One interesting thing for me actually was we were about 2-3 weeks, Robert Thompson, the CEO from News Corp, came to Dublin, and we were sitting having dinner late at night, and we got into a conversation about journalism, and he was quite sort of passionate about the fact that when he was in Tiananmen Square in '89, and he was one of the few correspondents to actually be there in the square the night it happened. And he talked with great passion about what happened afterwards and his own kind of crisis of confidence in the quality of journalism. And I'm thinking, this feels like home, This is something with someone like that as the chief executive. I know this sounds like, blowing smoke up the behind of News Corp, but that was the moment I felt really comfortable with the fit, that it's a traditional journalism with the very person at the top of the leadership chain is somebody who could talk with that level of passion, experience, and insight into something he had witnessed as a journalist. That's the experience I've had.
Just to follow up on that quickly, in terms of after the acquisition, the sense I've gotten externally is you guys have been doing a fair amount of hiring. You know, what's on that level in terms of investment in it and growth, like what would you share in terms of headcount and things that have changed since that?
It's not dramatic. I think we've added about 8-9 people.
Which is a lot compared to the fact that you begin with 30. So that's
Yeah.
like,
Sure.
And they have been in key areas like development, our technology team. We want to be known as much as a technology company as a media company in many ways. We've also hired in Hong Kong, so we've now got 3 people in Hong Kong. And you know what we're doing going forward, I think, will be to look at our open newsroom and say, okay, we're serving Facebook, YouTube, etc., and there's a different type of service there. Can we look at maybe expanding that? But the key here is that we'll never be 2,000 people, because obviously, because of technology, with just 35 people, we did a pretty good job of scaling the acquisition of content. You know, we didn't increase our staff over the period of the 2 years before the acquisition, but we trebled the amount of content that we took in, again, because of technology. And again, that's something I would say to you about broadly. The digital dimes that are coming in, perhaps from advertising, may not be huge, but there's more profit in them because the cost base has decreased. And I think that's one thing that's helping a company like ours succeed and scale.
Do we have any other questions from folks? Yep, back there, great.
Hi, I've read on Twitter right now that there's about 200 to 400 videos you managed to license. We know about the social web being full of noise, but it still sounds little to me. So what's the difficulties you face with licensing?
So we basically make a decision that in certain cases when there's real news value, we don't do anything to impede its spread or distribution. So if there's a major news event, we just seek clearance, which means we ask the person who uploads the video, can our clients use that video with the appropriate credit? Now, if they choose to monetize that at the time or later, we can facilitate that, but we don't ask to license it. So we make a conscious choice for the majority of videos not to actually do that, to license it. We license videos. I mean, we have a small team at the moment, which is getting bigger. So I would expect that will increase. We're also moving into different verticals like sport, entertainment. So that will obviously increase the volume of the video we license as well. But, you know, we did 100 million views on our videos in March. You know, I want that to increase, but that's a pretty good size given, that probably beats the vast majority of public-facing news organizations. So yeah, you want to get it bigger, but sometimes big is not always good. Quality and being right is.
Question up front.
Wardle, this is the difficult one.
I'm just really interested in the health and safety issues around, obviously, licensing and UGC. And I haven't made up my mind up here about the idea that if somebody is running in the Boston Marathon with a GoPro camera on her head and everybody around the world use that video a lot of times and she gets no compensation, I kind of struggle with that. But I massively struggle with the idea that over time people will work out that there's money to be had in breaking news content. And I don't know what the answer is, but I just really struggle that if we have this conversation in 2 years' time, the Wild West as it is, and I know you've talked about ethical journalism for a long time, I think we really need to think about these ethics and the uploaders, and I'm not really sure what the answer is, because you can have a model, but there are other licensing companies out there that just say, doesn't matter if you want money, I'm going to get you money, because there are people out there who will pay, and I just think about the future. We've really got to think about this strongly.
And I think it's a good point to always keep in mind, and as you said, Claire, I'm not sure there are clear answers yet, but the principle that journalism has applied, which is that we don't, more often than not, we ignore staged events. We don't think of that as journalism just because somebody's staging it to get attention. I think that principle still applies in terms of what you are willing to license and not. But there will always be people staging a funny cat video thinking, or funny setting their hair on fire video thinking somebody's going to pay them a lot of money. And I think it's going to be a case-by-case issue, is my sense.
Yeah, I think also the health and safety issues are something that's primary concern for me. When I was a foreign correspondent, we were sent away for a week's residential training with former special forces before we were sent out to the field. Today, 19-year-old journalists who once would start off reporting the local town hall are jumping on planes with cameras and going to Syria. So, and we get money from videos shot by people in dangerous situations. And I think that's one of the things that bears very heavily on me. I don't have all the answers. We do very carefully check out what people are doing. So storm chasing, for example, in the United States, is incredibly dangerous. Right. And we make sure that we're working with people that we know. Having said that, we know at the moment that we're not doing enough. And it keeps me awake at night to think that there's a whole generation of journalists that will have not gone through the same thing. I mean, the battlefield first aid that I got, to this day, it stays with me. And so I think what we need to do is work with people like DART, INSEE, the International News Safety Institute, Rory Peck Institute. I think a lot more money needs to go into the support. Those institutions themselves, and journalism schools as well, need to shift their focus to have an element of safety in there. I think we also need to have a lot more technical support in terms of hardware, so if people can actually geolocate where they are, where they can actually send distress signals. There's a responsibility, I think, as well for us to train a core of, and I used to say there was no such thing as citizen journalism. There is actually emerging now a kind of a pro-am group of people. And I think we can help train them. And I think we can, through educational institutions particularly, start working on this as a big priority. So again, and I'm not saying I have all the answers here. I do not. But it's again, as I totally share your concern.
Final question. Does anyone have one? Okay, we've got two. We still have time, so we'll take those two.
Mark, you've talked a lot in the past about a bad tweet, finding the Holy Grail. That tweet alerted the world to what happened to Osama bin Laden. It went around the world, it went viral very quickly, but it's finding that tweet ahead of time, ahead of the competition. How far away are you from the Holy Grail and getting that tweet first before anybody else?
Yeah, the context of this, obviously, is Abbottabad, Osama bin Laden, special forces come in on their helicopters, and a guy called Really Virtual on Twitter goes, "Oh my God, there's helicopters above my head, what's going on?" I bet at this very same time, a former Defense Department official in Washington goes, "Holy shit, they've killed Osama." Now, as you say, the Holy Grail for us is connecting those two things. Black swans. So, we're in the search now, we're in the era of discovery. Things just come and hit you on the left side of the head without you noticing them coming. You don't just search for things. And so what we're looking at is our team called a precog news, which is taken from a movie, if you know the movie, where they have these sort of like three women in a bag of slime basically thinking thoughts about who's going to kill each other in the future. They're nerds. So basically what we're looking at here is the idea that we can game the chances that we can get the black swan by increasing the level of granularity on our Twitter lists and our databases, so that essentially velocity being a good measurement. If we're watching Pakistan, we wouldn't have picked up his tweet. But if we'd built Abbottabad and we'd seen this having traction, we would have definitely been ahead of everybody else. So I think it's the granularity of searching. We could now have this room circled and see all the content emerging from it. And I think as we do that more and more, we're going to get closer to that Holy Grail. But we're still a long way from it. And, we have to deal with big issues along the way. Privacy. I don't know if we all know that your tweets are so searchable. And I wonder, should we be having some sort of conversation about teaching people not to tweet? I know I'm saying that as a person who's making money. Maybe you just shouldn't. I'll give you an example. We picked up a piece of content from an employee of a big social network that took a photograph of her name badge, and in property development, it's sensitive information some people are tweeting. And so perhaps we should talk about that as well.
The other question? Yes.
You were mentioning that there's an awful lot of human work involved in verifying the videos, and something that's been on my mind recently is the idea that people are getting almost a secondary post-traumatic stress disorder from watching all of these really nasty videos. Mm-hmm. Do you guys have sanctioned 5-minute unicorn breaks, kittens?
Unicorn breaks.
Yeah, so this became an issue for us quite quickly. The Arab Spring happened, and before we knew it, as I say, I was a war correspondent. I've seen some horrible things up close. I've never seen anything like this, stuff that I was seeing. And so it's also worsened because when I was going to a war zone, my senses were heightened to see this stuff. But if you're sitting and you're 24 years old in an office in Dublin, and you're suddenly coming across a corpse with that ahead, that became an issue. So we hired counselors. We brought the counselors in. They did education training sessions about what to watch out for to see if you were developing any kind of problems. And then obviously we have an ongoing relationship with the counselor if people feel they have a problem. We also had some great support and leadership from Bruce Shapiro from the DART Center up in New York, who came in. And the one thing he said was that people who do best in coping with stressful situations like this are people who believe in the mission of the company they work for. And when you feel there's a purpose to seeing this awful stuff, they say you build up a mechanism to cope. In the same way, I think with a lot of foreign correspondents, what stops them going mad is the feeling they have to witness this. And so I think there is that sense of mission for the people who do this. But I don't underestimate it. I've friends who've had PTSD. I've seen the impact it's had in their lives. And, you know, I saw signs of it, I think, to an extent in one or two people I worked with in Storyful, and we've moved to correct that. But again, not enough attention is one of the other areas we don't pay enough attention to. And God, there are so many, it'll take 150 years to rectify that.
Just to add one thing to that, you mentioned the Dart Center. They have, if anyone's wondering how you sort of limit your exposure, they have tips that are available. And we had someone from the Dart Center in the verification handbook that I worked on with the European Journalism Center. We had somebody from the Dart Center in Europe write up a quick overview of, okay, so if you've been looking at really, gruesome UGC, here are some of the ways to limit your exposure, here are some of the ways to help your colleagues. So that's available for free to read at verificationhandbook.com, and it is absolutely a serious issue. You can get PTSD from viewing, prolonged exposure to this stuff. So not exactly a fun, light thing to end on, but thank you very much, Mark, Reju. Thank you all of you for your time and your questions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that was good. Really interesting.